Good morning, everyone. Shall we begin? So I'm here to welcome you to today's conference. And my name is Farès el-Dahdah, and I'm the director of the Humanities Research Center, or HRC. And as one of the co-sponsors of today's event, I should say that the HRC is particularly keen on being part of an event such as Collaborative Futures, for two reasons. One, this conference illustrates rather perfectly the public humanities initiative that we launched about 2 years ago. And with this initiative, our hope was that humanists at Rice, John, could play meaningful roles in the public sphere around the campus and beyond. The idea being that we'd provide interested faculty with the means to have their research engage the public at large so that they can chart new futures for the humanities. This has required that we focus on relationships with such institutions as the Menil Collection that not only serve the public, but can also contribute to the education and, who knows, even the eventual employment of Rice students, be it here or at other museums in town. The second reason why the HRC wanted to support this event is its own long-standing history in the space of information technology and the humanities. I think it all started back in 2003 when the HRC hosted a postdoc to help build the Travelers in the Middle East Digital Archive, or TIMEA. Then there was our Americas Archive Partnership, followed by Technology, Cognition, and Culture lecture series. But more importantly and more recently, we hosted a Sawyer seminar on the comparative study of cultures. It had the telling title of Platforms of Knowledge in a Wide Web of Worlds. And it looked at the production, participation, and politics of such efforts as your Collections Analysis Collaborative, or CAC. So, as far as the HRC is concerned, this was a perfect event before it even started, and I wish you all a great conference. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody, and welcome. My name is Paul Davis. I'm the curator of collections at the Menil. I want to echo Farès' warm greetings to you on day 2 of the CAC Collaborative Futures Conference. Yesterday, our keynote speaker, Dr. Brian Rose, addressed the need to communicate with diverse audiences about the loss of cultural heritage and the manipulation of historical memory. Military conflicts in the Middle East, increasingly unpredictable political landscapes of cultural heritage, and the destruction or removal of historical monuments. Dr. Rose gave us fodder to think about the close collaboration between the different professional communities engaged in the study, sale, protection, and presentation of cultural heritage. As we move forward, we encourage you to think of this conference as a conversation. And we have tried to build in as much time as possible for discussion, and we hope and we look forward to you taking part in that today. Before I begin with my presentation, I just wanted to do a couple housekeeping things. First, this is a working museum. Even though we're closed today, there are staff here, and you might notice them walking back and forth, but please don't be disturbed by opening doors, shutting doors. Secondly, for those of you who have not been to the Menil, the restrooms are here on the side, and we've actually put a cell phone charging station, so if you need to charge your cell phone, it's by the women's restroom in the little nook. On that note, please kindly remember to silence your cell phones. And also the Wi-Fi password is, for guests, is visitor with a capital V and an exclamation point at the end. So with the exception of the first series of presentations, the CAC scholars that will be speaking today will speak for about 20 or 30 minutes. We'll then have ample time to have a question and answer period of 15 to 20 minutes. As noted in the program, we have breaks spaced between the different sessions. And if you haven't already had some coffee, I entreat you to do so. If you need to get up please be kind and courteous to the speaker. And with that, I'd like to do a short presentation on the Menil Collection. So, as a very condensed introduction to the multifaceted history of the Menil Collection from the art of the ancient Mediterranean and the many individuals that have contributed to its formation and interpretation, I would like to begin by following the illustrative history of a 4th century Greek vessel. In 1949, John and Dominique de Menil purchased a simple, minimally adorned hydra at the Parc Bernet auction of objects from the late Joseph Brummer's New York gallery. Like their first object from ancient Greece, it was first displayed to the public in the 1958 exhibition, The Common Denominator, Modern Design, 3500 BCE to 1958, or the Contemporary Moment, at the Contemporary Art Museum in Houston. Curated by Houston-based interior designer Herbert Wells and Jermaine McKagy, the exhibition proved that, quote, style, in the modern sense, has been with us for thousands of years, end quote. Like other objects, the hydra appeared in the exhibition as an attribute of modern life in the interiors of contemporary homes. Indeed, between its public appearances, the hydra lived for a time on a credenza in the utility room of the de Menil's Houston home, paired with works by Max Ernst and Henri Matisse. In the utility room adjoining the kitchen, the hydra was part of the de Menil's house as laboratory for experimentation with works of art, clearly illustrated in the pre-museum photographs of the home. In the living room, a Roman period funeral mask on a mid-20th century coffee table shares the Charles James designed interior space with René Magritte's La Clé du Verre and a display of African and oceanic objects. An aesthetically dynamic environment, the modern interior spaces of the de Menil home equitably domesticated the arts of different civilizations and time periods, much in the vein of McKagy's earlier exhibition, The Common Denominator. The hydra was next featured, sorry, I had a feeling it was going to do that. The hydra was next featured in the traveling exhibition in 1970, The 10 Centuries That Shaped the West, Greek and Roman Art in Texas Collections, which Dominique de Menil curated in coordination with scholar, curator, dealer Herbert Hoffman. Displayed with red and black figure vessels in the dramatically lighted gallery, the bare black vessel of the hydra, surface of the hydra, was an anomalous disappearing presence in the exhibition. The hydra remained in museum storage from 1987 until artist Haim Steinbach selected the ancient vessel for his 2014 exhibition, Fresh, Haim Steinbach and the Objects from the Permanent Collection. As part of Steinbach's tabletop gallery, the hydra was isolated on a pedestal behind a vitrine, within a room of infrequently exhibited other things, 20th century sculptures, a putative Persian mace, a trick-or-treater's jack-o'-lantern, and more other stuff, etc. The 20th century life of the 4th century hydra exemplifies the movements and shifting context between familiar, private spaces of collectors and the authoritative vitrines and public gallery spaces that define ancient works of art, particularly those in the Menil's collection. The de Menils acquired over 700 objects originating from ancient civilizations of the ancient Mediterranean, of the Mediterranean, Africa, Near East, and Asia. Today, there are nearly 600 accessioned objects in the Ancient World Department of the Menil's permanent collection. Approximately 64% of this part of the collection was acquired before 1970, which, as we learned last night, doesn't really mean a lot anymore. There were a few early acquisitions of objects in the 1930s and 1940s, a Roman coin from Alexandria, a fragment bronze falcon sculpture from Egypt, purchased at a Parisian gallery, and an aforementioned hydra. However, more than half of the objects were acquired between 1960 and 1970, during a period of intense institutional collaboration, exhibition making, and social engagement by the Menil Foundation. Between 1971 and 1987, a period in which the de Menil's plan for the museum moved from private conception to public reality, another 177 objects were added to the collection of art from the ancient world. Less than 20 objects in this area have been added to the permanent collection since then. and the last year in which objects were accessioned into the collection was 1997. Understandably and rather straightforwardly, these trends in collecting reflect the life events, relationships, and passions of Dominique de Menil, who passed in 1997 and was the principal force behind the development of this focus in the collection. A self-proclaimed, quote, frustrated archaeologist fascinated by ancient pieces, end quote. Her life in Houston with John de Menil during the mid-20th century aspired to cultivate an appreciation of the arts in the city and to enrich the education of university students with works from their growing collection and to champion areas of concern such as civil rights and religious tolerance. During the same period, the de Menils made significant commitments to the University of St. Thomas, founding and staffing an art history department and utilizing their growing private collection for the education of university students. According to Rice University Emeritus Professor of Art History, William Canfield, it was, quote, from this point forward that the de Menils referred to their collection as a teaching collection, end quote. And the trajectory of their personal collecting practices became intimately intertwined with the educational needs of the university students and Houstonians. By the early 1970s, plans to move the collection to Montrose and the creation of the present museum where we find ourselves today were already in motion. Less apparent in those trends of their collecting are short, episodic, and focused directions in their collecting that centered on developing exhibitions and specific projects. Tellingly, an estimated 21% of the collection of art from the ancient world belongs to the Image of the Black, a project that de Menils established in 1960 as part of their broader support of the civil rights movement. These trends do not reveal the ways in which these trends also do not reveal the ways in which their collecting reinforce connections in the southern region of the United States with important dealers and scholars of antiquities at numerous art institutions and universities around the world. A watershed exhibition that united relatively unknown private and public collections in Texas, 10 centuries that shaped the West, was exemplary in this regard. John and Dominique de Menil, professors Philip Oliver Smith and Walter Widrig, and former art history students like Helen Winkler, worked with Herbert Hoffman on the exhibition and its catalog, making very last minute, additions and deletions to the checklists. And here's a slide of Dominique de Menil with Gilbert Demmin, Mr. Gilbert Demmin, and Herbert Hoffman. Of course, the Demmin collection is in San Antonio. On the recommendation of Herbert Hoffman, the de Menils acquired approximately 68 works within the last 2 years before the exhibition's opening, 40 of which were included in the exhibition. As a quick example, writing less than a year before the opening, Hoffman advised the purchase of an Etruscan guardian lion, which he believed to be, quote, the finest to have been found so far, end quote. 10 centuries manifests the curatorial legacy of Dominique de Menil and the current installation of art from the ancient world at the Menil Collection. Photographs of the Boeotian cases from 1970 and from 2014 suggest that 10 centuries served as a successful draft composition for Dominique de Menil's installation in 1987. To conclude, for many of the objects in the Menil's collection of art from the ancient world, 1987 is their present. Outside the object vitrines and beyond an installation many individuals affectionately consider timeless, nearly 30 years of scholarship on these ancient civilizations has transpired. In seeking to reinvigorate discussions with scholars, students, other institutions, and the public about the history and display of works of art, the mission of the Collections Analysis Collaborative seeks to move forward with the past and to continue the educational and social mission originally envisioned by the de Menils for their collection. Thank you. And now please welcome Sarah and John.
Good morning. My name is Sarah Kielt Costello. I'm assistant professor of art history at the University of Houston, Clear Lake. My colleague, John Hopkins, is assistant professor of art history at Rice University. We are going to just divide our talk up in half, so I'll talk and then I'll turn it over to John. John and I have worked with Paul in developing this project with our own particular interests and goals driving us. Our affection for the collection is foremost among those. As longtime residents of Houston, we appreciate what it means to Houstonians. This intimate, accessible collection of antiquities presents the opportunity to learn about the past, to reflect on the human condition, to travel over time and distance within the quiet confines of a meditative space. As teachers, we have sent hundreds, maybe over 1,000 students here with instructions to look closely. The minimal labeling works perfectly for assignments focused on observation. But it is as art historians and archaeologists that we, with Paul, designed this project. We recognize the opportunity to approach the problem that so many museum collections face: antiquities with incomplete life stories. Purchased decades ago, often lacking full provenance records, and seldom with known provenience. These pieces have histories to tell, but those histories remain elusive. When most of the objects were acquired, these questions were not on the minds of collectors, not even those as sophisticated as John and Dominique de Menil. They had a rare prescience for stewardship, apparent in the circumstances of the Byzantine fresco acquisition and return. The 1970 UNESCO Convention and 1983 Convention ratifying it began to change the climate that surrounded the collection of antiquities. Institutions, sometimes quietly and sometimes under a very public spotlight, were forced to contemplate their collections of antiquities. The tide in museum acquisition slowly began to change. Since then, museums, auction houses, and collectors have faced a new reality wherein provenance and archaeological context have gained a new position. In 2013, the American Association of Museum Directors made further additions to its guidelines, urging museums to follow the outcomes of UNESCO 1970 and explicitly referring to museums as stewards of cultural heritage. In response to these shifts, some museums have created provenance initiatives to investigate the biographies of objects. You'll hear about the Gettys shortly from Nicole Budrovich, and those of you participating in the workshop tomorrow will hear from Tori Reed, the curator of provenance at the MFA in Boston. The landscape of expectations for museums has transformed. It has been difficult to keep pace. The new regime requires labor, money, and help. As John, Paul, and I walked through the Menil 2 years ago, what we saw before us was the apparently Sisyphean task of taking stock of these changes, writing the course of the ship, and attending to a collection with a complicated past. The collection deserves this attention. The full stories of these objects make them all the more fascinating, more affecting, to use Paul's term. Our project, therefore, began from one simple question, focused on the objects just a few paces from this room. How do you do this? How do you do the kind of exhaustive research that is required to be a good steward of the cultural heritage that the Menil is supposed to protect and display for all to see? How do you address all of the complicated questions that arise when an object's legitimacy is brought into question by a visiting scholar? We quickly realized that the only way forward was through collaborative work among museum professionals, academics, and students. We want to highlight the object's social histories and their provenances and bring transparency to these records, even to gaps in these records. We want to investigate how collections, whether large or small, can manage the time-consuming cultural and provenance research that antiquities demand. This kind of work is hard. It requires expertise in dozens of fields, many languages, and specialized knowledge of dealers, archives, and politics that most academics do not possess. Collaboration is therefore the key. We turn to experts in different areas and ask them to share their expertise. These academics and curators were given open files, the extant biographies of these objects. Free to ask any question, probe any issue, and speak on any subject, our scholars have visited the collection and corresponded with us and with each other for the past 6 months on the discoveries they've made. You will hear them. Some have untangled fabricated histories and uncovered the very sites, where objects came from, correcting decades of misinformation that has bored its way into the scholarship. Many have pointed to the unique collection and how much it reveals about the purpose behind the Menil's assemblage, highlighting the very current relevance of this institution and these very old objects.
It must already be clear how collaborative this work must be. Paul, Sarah, and I speaking jointly, 9 other speakers here to address the collection today. Were we to have all participants speak, including the many students who have contributed invaluably to the project, it would number over 30. When we began, no armature, very little research, and no manual for museums, large or small, existed for this kind of project. We've been trying to create both a philosophy and a method, and this has required counsel and collaboration not only from art historical and archaeological specialists. In 2016, these kinds of studies need not await print, and a substantial part of our project has been to create a digital platform for updating and managing the project. We're grateful for the patience of colleagues Jeff Koffler and Consuelo Gutierrez, Jeff Koffler at Rice and Consuelo Gutierrez here at the Menil. As we have worked through this, it's been testing. Together, we have created a robust, safe digital archive on shared shelf that houses more than just the information given over to the public, and it's designed to integrate with the museum's software. And we've created not only a data set, but also an analytical humanities infrastructure with argumentation. This element is crucial for our students. As they work, they learn that for each simple statement on a wall label, libation vessel, for example, there is a volume of research and sound argumentation to support it, and they create it. They also get credit for their work on our website and in the digital archive. Their research and that of our scholars here is then held in the Menil's records for anyone to inspect and update. In order to make this work possible, David Aylesworth, Julie Teese, and Paul have had to rig a system that is for most museums an internal one, so that one outside scholar after another is able to safely access dozens of files, often very quickly. All of this in just the first 9 months of our project. And some of that work has already made its way onto our web portal, which I encourage you to visit. This is the catalog, the conversations, which is a blog, and the observations, which I'll come back to in a minute. We see this as only the beginning. As this conference has approached, we've looked to the future of our project. First and foremost, we hope that our scholars will remain engaged well beyond tomorrow. You have been the lifeblood of this project so far, and we are very lucky to have such great people to work with. In the past few weeks, we've gotten requests from other colleagues who would like to join the group. Currently, we're seeking funding to create a regular speaker series that will bring in scholars to study the Menil's Antiquities collection further and present their findings to the community on a routine basis. The Rice course on Provenance study and the Menil will continue next year and the following as long as I can keep it going, bringing in more student researchers to fill out the Provenance catalog alongside scholars. Finally, and most ambitiously, we're working to create a seamless digital antiquities provenance program one that other institutions, museums, and universities can use freely to organize and facilitate the safe, clear, full research of objects for students, scholars, and staff, from introduction to the purpose and practice to web publication. As part of this, we'll remake our web portals so that it's more integrative of content and so that it can reach out to other connected digital archives more clearly, linking to open content and allowing scholars to find other related acquisitions at the Menil, at other institutions, and in other archives. So that's our project. That is what has brought these scholars here today and where we hope it will go. Our work is very much in progress. The Getty also has a project that's in progress. We've been lucky enough to meet with its leaders. Last year, I sat down with several of them, including David Saunders, Judith Barr, Nicole Budrovich, Claire Lyons, to talk about the hurdles and the possibilities. We were thrilled to have David visit here earlier this year to meet with students and with us to share ideas. We learned so much from that conversation that we asked him, Judith, and Nicole to write a contribution to our online publication, Observations. And as of this morning, that contribution, our first, is live. Today, and now, we are fortunate to have Nicole here to speak to us about what they've been up to. Nicole Budrovich is curatorial assistant at the Getty. After receiving her BA from Berkeley and her MA from UC Davis, she went on to work excavating the files, pun intended, of tens of thousands of objects in the Antiquities collection at the Getty Villa. She's published on mosaics and spoken about their ongoing work, and today she will speak to us about the Antiquities Provenance project at the Getty. Nicole.
Thank you. Okay. Awesome. Good morning, and thank you for that wonderful introduction. Thank you, John, Sarah, and Paul, for inviting me here to represent the Getty on behalf of this project. Obviously, a quick shout out, as you said, to David Saunders and Judith Barr, who couldn't make it but contributed immensely both to the project and to this presentation. So, a few words of background, touching base on what Sarah mentioned and on last night's talk. As we're all aware, the collecting of antiquities has transformed over the last 15 years with close attention paid to the revision of acquisition policies. Less frequently discussed is how museums should work with objects in their collection that were acquired but not under today's standards. At the same time, this explosion of digital resources has transformed the ways museums present their collections and the information users seek. So, online database, here. Okay. Online databases are, Oh, I can use this.
Yeah, and that's a laser pointer. That's
perfect. Thank you. Let me try this. Yeah. Online databases are vital platforms for enabling access, and at the Getty, we are undertaking to present all aspects of our collections online. In the Antiquities Department, Provenance, research is a key focus, and we continue to adapt and touch base with colleagues as the project evolves. This past year, it's been very exciting to see the Menil project develop, as it offers a model for tackling a topic that all museums should address. At the Getty, the entire collection was made available and searchable online about 5-ish years ago, and our project was developed to research and verify the information presented there. If you count every single shard, coin, and tessera, the Antiquities collection numbers nearly 47,000 objects. This appeared quite an imposing number at the outset, but is actually manageable since many fragments belong to single objects. Large batches of material came into the museum as a single acquisition, and we can think of these objects as being parents and children. So here you have the online record for the Getty's Orpheus mosaic, which contains 36 child records ranging from large fragments all the way down to tesserae. And obviously all these share an acquisition history, but they count as 36 records. So in researching the ownership history of a single child record, we can update records for whole family. Nonetheless, the collection encompasses a large body of material, so we prioritized objects on display in the permanent galleries, which number about 1,400 objects. Having worked through these in the first 2 years of the project, it's been efficient to progress to the rest by donor or vendor, targeting the larger groups first. Beyond efficiency, this method has the benefit of giving us a sense of the collector's taste and highlighting the dealers with whom they worked. All the information that we can verify is then made available for the record on its online collection page, alongside bibliographies, exhibition histories, and descriptions. These are kind of screenshots showing what you'd see for the same object. Naturally, our research process has evolved over the years, and there are always new or old leads to pursue. We've been fortunate to devote resources to this work, namely myself and Judith, and also Dave at the helm. But as with any project, it has a budget and a time frame. Our intent is to do a first pass for all the records in our collection, hoping that it will be feasible in the longer term to return to particular objects and chase down references. So, to our methods and how to start. Like the Menil, the Getty is a relatively young institution, but over the decades, information about these acquisitions would reside in various departments across the museum. Our biggest push, therefore, has been to bring together paperwork from various locations. The curatorial files and existing records always serve as the first point of reference, but we have worked closely with registrars to flesh out the history of an object's acquisition and how it came to the museum, be that physically through shipping paperwork or invoices. We've also made use of documentation in institutional archives, such as Mr. Getty's correspondence, and here's a screenshot of his diaries, which were recently digitized, but that project, to fully have them searchable, is still ongoing. This often completes the picture sketched out by our own files, providing valuable cross-references or otherwise unrecorded information. So to the objects. Before diving into the file cabinets, it pays to look at the artifact in question. Ancient objects have complicated biographies, and their current state may reveal much about their histories, as this Athenian volute crater demonstrates. Today, what you see on display is a combination of fragments the Getty acquired in 1977 and others that are on long-term loan from the Louvre. The Louvre fragments had once been incorporated into a different vase, acquired from Giampetro Campagna, a 19th century Italian antiquarian who amassed an incredibly rich collection of Greek and Roman antiquities. The scholar John Beasley later studied the vase in Paris and concluded that it was in fact a restorer's fabrication, combining fragments from two vases, one by the Berlin painter and the other by the Kleophrades painter. The pastiche was subsequently disassembled, and in the 1970s, a number of fragments attributed to the Kleophrades painter were with the dealer Nicholas Koudalakis, were identified as being some of those once in the Louvre crater. So here's the Berlin painter on top, and now these are the Koudalakis fragments. And the Getty acquired these in 1977, and a few years later, the Louvre kindly lent their joining fragments so that the vase could be reassembled. So you can kind of see where the Louvre fragments on the right join up with the Getty fragments. So they're still, and on the left is what the vase looks like today. Our conservators have been especially helpful as we look closely at restoration campaigns. The analysis of joining techniques in marble sculptures or manufactured pigments for fills can help to establish a chronology. In other cases, provenance research can piggyback on ostensibly unrelated projects. In the course of the multi-institution project, Ancient Panel Paintings, Examination, Analysis, and Research, which we call APPEAR for short, our conservator, Marie Svoboda, has been studying Roman Egyptian portraits in our collection to learn more about their production. Her analysis of each involves thorough documentation, including photography of the reverses. Rarely illustrated, these can be gold for provenance research, for it's here that stamps, numbers, and other markings can be found. On this example, you can see the stamp of Theodor Graf, a well-known Viennese collector of Egyptian antiquities. And in this case, we actually knew the object was in the Graf collection, but sharing this documentation with other institutions can lead to further provenances being confirmed or discovered. As these examples demonstrate, a good deal of time is spent corroborating existing information. Our project is substantial, but there are advantages to working on a broad scale. for information about one object often feeds back into research on others. On finally getting a hold of a hard-to-find auction catalog, we found that it often provides leads for multiple objects. And here, this is where having a team of us working is incredibly useful, because often Judith will have an auction catalog that she'll say, oh, I think I saw this, and then give it to me, and I can reference. And so having, even just in one office space, is really useful. And there's much to be said for serendipity, or better, making the most of fortuitous circumstances. Art journals or dealer publications regularly include advertisements and illustrations that have helped to secure dates. And even when seeking a particular citation, it's always worthwhile to follow up on the footnotes. For instance, we already knew that the Getty's Ajax Cup, acquired from Walter Barrice, included a fragment from Tübingen University. But thanks to a footnote in a 1980 publication, we were able to establish that that fragment had in fact been published in 1924. 40 years prior to Barrice acquired the cup. And this sort of thing was in the records, but just hadn't been put together without the research. Further, by working with through the entire collection, we've begun to build an understanding of the antiquities market. We can trace patterns and relationships among dealers or institutions, or discern how a particular collection has been dispersed. And this in turn shapes the course of future investigations. Grains of salt. Side by side with this experience is the development of a discerning eye. One of the key rules for any provenance researcher is not to believe everything you read, which anyone who's worked on, yes. So, or at the very least, be ready with a few grains or handfuls of salt. Before the scrupulous acquisition requirements and digital research tools of today, historical provenances could and would be invoked on official paperwork with little supporting evidence. A similar conundrum is presented by the phrase that appears all too often in the context of antiquities, said to be from. It can't be stressed enough that all ancient artifacts are diminished when the context of their discovery has been lost, a point yesterday's keynote persuasively addressed. We've seen all too frequently that as years pass and catalog entries get rewritten, said to be from can slip to the more factual sounding from. In that respect, keeping the said to be seems essential, highlighting that this is yet unverified information. But even when the said to be endures, what does it mean? Who said it, and when, and why? Is it purely a stylistic assertion, or a passing reference from a dealer who knew or wanted to suggest he knew where an object had been unearthed? There is little to gain from perpetuating misinformation, but said to be statements are also part of an object's biography. Even if demonstrably false, they might have value from the perspective of understanding art market trends. So here we have this gilt silver bowl in the Getty's collection, which was first published in the Christie's sale catalog as said to be found in Pompeii. Well, it's up there. Anyway, said to be found in Pompeii with a plausible provenance through the Savoy family. However, Christie's online records and other documentation that we've come across uses the wording found in Pompeii. And research into discrepancy and how to best present this object on our online collection pages is still ongoing. Each institution will find its own way to deal with this very gray area. Although as provenance research presses ahead, it would be ideal to seek some consistency in the format and syntax of online records. For the Getty's collection pages, our initial effort is to present the information that we've been able to verify. Said to be and its cognates generally are noted in our files with the intent that once ownership histories for everything is available online, we can return to this information and explore it more fully. So some filling in the gaps. Speaking of this is, I think, the same auction, the 1949 that was mentioned earlier, maybe the Bremer sale. But anyway, the importance of deeper research is clear from the surprising number of times provenance information slips from a published record. Good, solid references to previous owners that occur in early publications may be omitted in later sale catalogs. For example, this marble herm was published in the 1949 sale of the Bremer Collection, where it is recorded as previously in the collection of William Randolph Hearst. The herm was not sold at that auction, and 30 years later it was on the market again. In another Bremer Collection sale, pictured here, but the catalog this time does not mention Hearst as a previous owner. Thanks to the recently digitized Bremer gallery records, we were able to track down the full history, verify the Hearst ownership, and fill in other gaps in the provenance. For instance, who had sold it to the Bremers initially, and a few other sales that occurred in between. Pictured here is the original 1924 Bremer catalog card for the Herm with its sale history, and a nice drawing of what it looked like. Even in the case of an object that has a history going back centuries, there's always more to discover. An excellent example is the Lansdowne Tiberius. This portrait was documented in the collection of the first Marquess of Lansdowne, then a full sculpture, more on that later, and remained in the family for over 100 years. It was sold by Christie's in 1930, and the Getty Research Institute has an annotated copy of the sale catalog, where it's recorded that the Tiberius was bought by Lorbet. Henrietta Lorbet and her husband, Joseph Altunian, were art dealers in Paris in the first half of the 20th century. The trail goes quiet during interwar years until the Tiberius reappears in the 1966 Sotheby's sale in London. Correspondences with colleagues who are currently working on a full study of the Lansdowne collection brought to light that the dealer George Cremitas sold the portrait at Sotheby's, so we've been able to add that detail to our provenance chain. Sorry. The statue was still complete at this point. You can see it there. In fact, the head and body don't belong together. The piecing together of parts of ancient statues was common practice in the 18th and 19th centuries. Yet the Getty acquired the head alone, pictured on the left, in 1971. Our curatorial files held no information about what happened to the body. Deeper exploration, however, revealed that the Chrysler Museum in Norfolk had purchased the torso in 1971, and it remains there today. Evidently, head and body had been taken apart between 1966 and 71 and were sold separately by the dealer. Consulting and documenting a museum's internal resources is a large undertaking, but it is finite. The much greater challenge, and this is where great strides can be made through opening access to archives and sharing research, is in reviewing sources beyond one's own institution. Local newspapers are one valuable pool of information. This marble head, acquired in 1974, had been previously published in 1960, and according to a note in our files, had been on loan in Basel for a decade. But we had no proof of this. In chasing up a reference to the Basler Nachrichten, we found corroboration. The edition for March 15th 1950 devoted a brief column to the exhibition of Greek art in Basel, featuring an image of the marble head, thereby providing a secure date. More concentrated resources are dealer archives, and it's very exciting to see increasing numbers of these being digitized and made available. A case point is the work undertaken by the Metropolitan with the Bremer Gallery records, which I mentioned earlier. Joseph and Ernest Bremer were major art dealers in the first half of the 20th century, and a great deal of material now in American museums passed through their hands. One example is the Getty's Orpheus mosaic. Much of its early history was known from existing sources, including the fact that it had come to the Bremers in 1941 from Hearst. But through the digital archive, we were able to discover that the Bremers themselves had sold the mosaic to Hearst in 1927. And here's an image of its 1941 catalog card with sale history. The archive also included an unexpected document, a hand-drawn map of the excavation plan, marking the location of the mosaics at the time of their discovery. Earlier publications of the Orpheus mosaic and others from the same villa had made mention of such a plan, but to the best of our knowledge, it had been lost. It's unclear whether this probably isn't the original, it might be one that someone made after the original, which is now lost. The rediscovery of the drawing thus provides a critical basis for further research. And this is an example where the Bremer Gallery the Bremer archives were just digitized en masse, and we were able to go through and find this. So they were partially linked, but building the connections took kind of both ends. So, concluding. Now that we've been working on the project for a number of years, we have a clearer understanding of the terrain, the resources that are available, and those that we'd wish for. We've been particularly inspired by colleagues working on World War II era provenance. Substantial progress has been made in scanning auction catalogs, making archives accessible, and developing networks for researchers. These provide valuable models for the future. Likewise, it's been very encouraging to witness increased support and interest for provenance research for antiquities from the highest levels, notably the joint AIA-AAMD meeting in Penn in April, and a workshop on provenance at the upcoming AIA meeting in Toronto. As the interdisciplinary nature of the Menil project demonstrates so well, collaboration is really the strongest way forward. This can range from face-to-face exchanges to online resources that are open to all interested parties. We are particularly looking forward to the launch of the British School at Rome's Marshall Archive database, which will illuminate the early 20th century, a critical period in the history of collecting antiquities. I understand that the project director was unable to join us here in Houston, but Valerie Scott is here and perhaps can answer any questions on this. Anyway, looking ahead, it would be great to establish a compendium of notable collectors and dealers on the model of the Smithsonian's Asian Art Provenance Connections project. And there are many other resources we'd love to develop: a database of dealer signatures and letterheads, the digitization of antiquities auction catalogs, and common standards for presenting provenance information online. Real progress for the field will come through the development of resources for scholars and museum professionals to undertake provenance research, wherever they may be. Thank you.
Questions? We have time for questions for Nicole.
My project.
Thank you. This is fascinating and a challenge. My question is to what extent your collaboration involves countries of origin?
With countries of origin? Good question. Speaking to the project at this point, we're still, even though we've been at it for 4 years, we consider it the first pass. So we're getting all our internal documentation verified. That said, if countries of origin approach us, that's recognized. But I think that next step, that's kind of in the next phase of reaching out and making those kind of collaborations. But yeah, we're mostly focusing on art, because everything right now, which I kind of showed, is bringing together, everything's been spread across the institution, bringing that together and supporting it with external documentation. But we don't have the time to go too deep into that kind of thing, so yeah.
I understand why. I asked because I happen to know in Greece, for example, there is an entire department under the official archaeological service that it focuses on art dealers and this dimension of the circulation of antiquities. They have been very, very active in the last 20 years. So there might be missing links if they are. If you want to expand the collaboration to this area.
We should talk. But yeah, I know resources and other things that are available, and we have colleagues in Greece and other institutions, so we're able to talk about these things. But I think, yeah, it's important to fill in the gaps, especially if there's projects going on that address the same issues.
Are there any further questions?
Thank you for the talk. It's not really... I'll just try to project. So more of a comment than anything else. It's interesting to see, a major museum with tremendous numbers of objects. Mind-boggling number of objects and records, kind of bring its resources to bear on such a project, and the resources are more considerable, shall we say, than what's available, say, in a university museum. So I'm kind of curious about whether you have any thoughts about how academic institutions that are trying to do this kind of work and using students the way Bryce has done and Duke has done, where I teach. Students who often don't have this kind of expertise, but we want to involve them in our work, and they can make really, significant contributions, but not at this level. So is there some way to, bring this to a different level of scholarship, like that is to say, scholars in training?
Right. Yes, exactly. I think this kind of collaboration is basically, you need to build the resources. So the more, and the Getty really is in a position to do this. And I think getting its collections in order and putting that provenance information online, in the process we've learned about all these archives and sources, and being able to bring that together in a way that's comprehensive for, younger scholars and universities to be able to use that. I think that's kind of where the key would be. Right now, there's the idea of making, these dealer letterhead indexes or other things that could be useful launch points for people working on this sort of thing. But I think basically you need to build up the resources, and I think the Getty is probably the best to do that. But I also don't know where the plan is to go there. Yeah.
I love the idea of developing a centralized space with all of the digital archives, with a kind of almost an instruction manual for how to go forward that could be used for
exactly, like a not to don't miss this resource or this other thing. Or even Judith and I have been realizing you have to request multiple auction catalogs. This is obvious, but just because the price lists or the annotations will vary depending. And so, just increasing the amount of information available is just key to, but of course having a place where an amateur scholar could come and say, oh, these are the resources available and this is how I'd progress. Yeah.
Hi. How often have you uncovered information that was uncomfortable or potentially
good question.
Might lead to repatriation?
Me personally, not. So that, there's a threshold of, is what is verifiable. Me personally, I have not often, ever, but our department has, and that's a good question that we're working on moving forward. I guess there's examples where we found very clear cases that Jens found an example of a portrait head, this was a few years ago, that had been in a church and had been stolen, but had been in the Getty, and so they returned it. But that was through internal research. And that was it was very clear. But in these more, ones where you're like, well, we don't know, but this might not look good or whatnot, we're working forward, and basically we're in dialogue with council and kind of, if anything comes up, and if it's verifiable, it goes online. So if it seems like something that someone wants to follow up on, that's fine, and we alert the people at the Getty. But I think personally me, I haven't had that, to deal with that too much, so. Yeah, and obviously this was a presentation kind of highlighting the goals and the possibilities, and the said to be discussion was probably the closest to that gray area, and that bowl is an example of this, but so. Yeah.
Can we thank Nicole again? I think this is a good moment to make another plug, a little reminder for our workshop tomorrow, because some of these questions of provenance will be addressed also by Tori Reed, who does this work at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, and she'll share some of her experience with us. So if you can join us at Rice University tomorrow for the workshop, we'll be addressing some of these points. Our next speaker today, this morning, is Dr. Betsy Bryan. Dr. Betsy Bryan is the Alexander Badawi Professor of Egyptian Art and Archaeology at Johns Hopkins University. Like several of our collaborators, Dr. Bryan is not only a distinguished scholar of art history, but also an active field archaeologist, as well as an experienced museum professional. And this is the kind of trifecta of talents that we really sought in bringing in collaborators, because we wanted all of these perspectives to be represented. She has also recently been named Vice Dean for Academics in Arts and Sciences at Johns Hopkins. So she's a very busy woman, and we are extremely grateful to her attention to our project. Her paper this morning is entitled Egyptian Art in the Menil Collection, Talking to Objects and Hoping They Reply. Please welcome Dr. Bryan.
Well, while we're waiting for the thing to pop up, thank you so much. Okay. I want to start by thanking Paul Davis and Sarah Costello and John Hopkins for inviting me to participate in this really fascinating project. It's really sort of stirring to hear that people are tackling something that those of us in my age group thought would never really get this kind of attention. And I think there's so much that can be done, and listening to Nicole was just really riveting, so I thank you all. Now, I came over here at the beginning of May and had a chance to look at some of the Egyptian objects in the collection, and ended up deciding to talk really about just a single piece. And I wish that I could tell you that I have solved the issue of its life after excavation before it ended up at a dealer's to be sold. I can't tell you that, but I think that some interesting things have come along in the way, and they sort of break down into three little conversations with this object. The first conversation is really about its find place and perhaps its function and its ancient provenances. And the second conversation has to do with the excavator of this particular piece and the sort of modern history that surrounded the time of its excavation and the immediate years thereafter, which I have to say is not necessarily a very pleasant topic. And the last section really is to look at the piece as an Egyptologist might, thinking about it as an example of Egyptian history. A good deal was known about the owner of this object beforehand, but I have to say that a lot of that has been found to be not entirely correct, and we can slowly but surely improve on our knowledge. So that is how I intend to approach this, and with that said, I will begin to talk about this lintel of Ramses Nacht and Usermatre Nacht. Now, in the 1930s, the Germans were excavating at the site of Hermopolis. The ancient name Ashmedane, or modern name too, is Ashmedane. Is that? You told me. Which do I do for the laser? I'm sorry.
The laser is just press the center.
Okay.
It may not show up.
Okay. Well, all right. So you see on the map on the left the Nile Valley, and you see a blue circle. That is the location of Hermopolis. It is in Middle Egypt. Oh, great. Okay. Well, yeah, there we go. And it is the site of a huge cult center to the god Thoth, the god of the moon, and who is often shown as either a baboon or as an ibis-headed man. It was an enormous cult center. And during the period of the New Kingdom, a large new temple was built there by Ramses II. And this is the orientation of his temple that was built there. And in 1935, the excavator Gunther Roeder found that an area, actually, let me just go right back here, which is that blue rectangle here, there. Found in that area a group of mud brick and stone houses that dated to the New Kingdom. And these were fairly large-sized houses, as you can see here. This is actually one of the walls of the precinct, so they were built right up against it. And he found during that season, 3 partial lintels that had cornices. You can see the cornice here. that came from the doorways to these houses. And this one right in the center is the piece that is now in the Menil. Now here's an ancient Egyptian painting that's been redrawn, and you see two examples of these doorways where the entire enclosure, which would have been a mud brick enclosure, had a gate that would have been stone with a cornice. You also have the actual house of this elite person, and it also is a mud brick house with just such a stone doorway with a cornice. So our particular Menil lintel is half of one of these types of doorway lintels, whether it would have come from outside of a compound door or from the actual house door. It's not possible for us to say at this point. But as you see this depicted, this is actually a very similar time period represented in terms of the house and the entryway to that which the Menil piece comes from. Now here it is, and what you see is half of what this lintel would have had. There would have been a mirror image with the Ramses Nacht here facing to the left instead of to the right, and then above it a cornice. And what we have is a man who is well known to us as the high priest of Amun, certainly the most important religious role in ancient Egypt at that time. But of course, Amun-Re was not a god of Hermopolis, but rather of Thebes, and his cult center was at Karnak. So we see him seated, and we see him receiving flowers from his son, Usermat-Re Nacht, who was the great steward of the temple of Medinet Habu, which is the mortuary temple of Ramses III, and he's making an offering to his father. You'll probably be able to see right here very, very faintly in front of Ramses Nacht and in front of Usermat-Re Nacht that there are hieroglyphs. These are essentially the same text that we have running vertically on either end, and they simply identify these people and their titles. Now, one of the things that I found in the documentation in the dossier is a certain amount of confusion over the actual dimensions of this piece that dated back to the time of its acquisition. And you'll see that the dimensions here, which are approximately correct, were expressed elsewhere as being larger than that in width. Now, that seems to have become an issue between John de Menil and John Cooney, who published this piece for them. But it ended up being a rather simple problem, because when this piece was originally found, it actually had a second block attached to it, which was part of the right-hand jamb of the doorway. And when added to it, it came up with this 105 centimeter width, which was the source of this confusion. But the piece that came here was only the 80 centimeters or so in width. Now, what you see here is the photograph taken when it was found in 1935, and it was still pretty dirty, as you can see. There is even today pigment that is original pigment on the surface, some blue on the hair of Usermat-Re Nacht, and some red on the skin of Ramses Nacht. But one of the things that you can sort of see in this image, which you really can barely see now on the cleaned up lintel, which I'm sure was cleaned up by the vendor, is located right here. I have to come over there, sorry. In here, It's a stand which has probably a bouquet of flowers on it. And it is just the faintest traces of this are visible today when you look at it in the gallery. And I noticed it right away because the shape, size, and thickness of this particular piece are very, very much like the thousands of small blocks that we have from Amarna, where King Akhenaten built his city, and many of which ended up built into buildings that Ramses II built at Hermopolis. In other words, he quarried Akhenaten's site and brought the stuff over. So for me, when I first looked at this, the first thing I saw was a reused Amarna period piece. But when you look at it here, you can barely see that there's anything in there at all. But when you look at the uncleaned version, it's a lot easier to see it. And so here's an example of these types of talatat, or objects that were used by at Amarna to build Akhenaten's buildings, and this is also here in the Menil. Now, the vast majority of these that have been purchased since the post-war have this red paint on it, which is not ancient. All of them have been repainted, and it's one of the ways that one can actually identify them as coming from a find that happened in Hermopolis. And that happened in 1939. So the lintel of the Menil was found in 1935 and placed in a storeroom after it was photographed, and it was published. It was published in 1937. In 1939, they discovered an enormous hoard of these talatat. Now, probably not this one, because almost the entire group that Roeder found in 39 were representations of the king rather than and royal family. But I'll get to this in just a little bit moment later. So if you notice, the surface of this particular limestone is quite pitted, and the ones from Hermopolis talatat, not nearly as badly pitted as the Menil lintel, but actually it's very, very similar stone. And when you look at it, I'm very grateful to Carrie Dodson from the Conservation Department here for taking a whole group of photographs in different raking lights so that we could sort of see the uneven surfaces of the object, as well as a little bit of that stand that has been sunk here. So originally, this was a late 18th dynasty object that was similar to this sort of thing, although this one is a little larger. And I think it might even have been a house lintel even in the late 18th dynasty. But the entire surface has been cut away to recarve it, and just a tiny shade of the original stand is still there for you to see. Now, unfortunately, this particular kind of limestone is very, very fragile and flaky, and it's one of the reasons that the surface continues to disappear. But I think that we are on pretty solid ground now on understanding that the source of the stone for this lintel, made around 1100 BC, was a block dating to around 1350 BC that was among the many that Ramses II had brought across the river from Amarna to Hermopolis when he built his temple pylon. So this would be a similar kind of scene to what we would have had we, if there had in the late 18th dynasty, that's the kind of stand and group of things that were on it that was carved away in order to put in the scene with Ramses Nacht. And we see here from Amarna a couple of more examples that show such stands and the similar kind, of scene. Now, the second conversation that we've had with this object concerns the excavator. And as I said, Gunther Röder worked at Hermopolis throughout the 1930s. He was, unfortunately for him, he was forced to leave the country in 1939 when the war broke out, and didn't return again until after, long after the war ended. There were a lot of Germans that worked in Egypt in those years who were, in fact, very much involved with the Nazi Party. And in 1945, a very famous Egyptologist named George Steindorf, who was Jewish and had left Germany in 1939 to come to the United States. He was a research associate at the Walters Art Museum and then moved after that to Hollywood, North Hollywood in California. He wrote to his very close friend, John Wilson, at the University of Chicago. And I want to read you just a couple of passages from this letter, which is still in the archives of the University of Chicago and expresses some of the issues that have to do with people working in our field at that time. He writes, "Dear John, I've been asked on several occasions to furnish a list of German Egyptologists who have been actively affiliated with the Nazi Party and to tell to what extent they've violated the rules of international scholarship. I've hesitated to do so, but now it seems to be my duty to provide a list of those men who are unfit in the light of their past activities to have a part in the scholarly life of the post-war world." But he begins differently. He says there are a few German Egyptologists who have proved themselves men of honor, and he mentions very specifically a number, but I'm going to read you one. Dr. Ludwig Keimer, lecturer on Egyptology at the German University at Prague, a fanatical anti-Nazi born in Westphalia and educated in Germany for many years, resident of Cairo, known as a specialist in ancient Egyptian botany and zoology, and an expert in Egyptian antiquities. And lastly, Bernard von Bothmer, formerly for a number of years attached to the Berlin Museum, who left Germany of his own volition and together with his brother came to America because he would not live in a Nazi Germany. And many of you know that Bernard dropped the fun once he got here. He is now a private in the United States Army, his greatest wish to fight and conquer Nazism. Now I must present the other side of the picture. I accuse Dr. Hermann Grappau, professor of Egyptology and member of the Berlin Academy of Science, a man of truly base character. You know him by name as a pupil and collaborator of Ehrmann. So long as Ehrmann lived, he posed as a Democrat. Later, however, especially after Zeta passed away, he showed his true colors as an arch-Nazi and used every means of Ehrmann's and Zeta's successor in the professorship at the university. He persecuted everybody who did not say Heil Hitler and did not follow the Nazi flag. Finally, he succeeded. In my opinion, there is no one who excelled Grappau in meanness, hatefulness, and denunciation of those who were not of his political opinion. Grappau's counterpart and closest follower, Dr. Alfred Hermann. To characterize him, I need only to repeat what I have said about Grappau. About Gunther Röder's political position, I am not accurately informed. However, I suspect that he joined the Nazis. Röder became director of the Berlin Egyptian Museum, too important a job for a non-Nazi. Now, Alfred Hermann is the person who actually published the lintel of the de Menils in 1937 and was involved with Roeder throughout the time period of the excavations at Hermopolis. As you can see, from 1915 until 1940, Roeder was the director of the Hildesheim Museum, the Pleiades Museum in Hildesheim. And in that role, he wanted very much more, as we've now learned from other archives and documentation, to get ahead, and he wasn't going to get ahead. But he did do his excavation and stored all of the material that he had found from 1930 to 1939 in the magazine at the site of Hermopolis. And this includes all of the Amarna Talatat as well as the de Menil lintel. The actual publication of the excavations did not appear until 1959. And that's because Roeder left the country. He was not coming back. He originally said that he would return in the January of 1940, and of course that didn't happen. So more than 20 years passed before the publication of the Hermopolis excavations. Now, we know that soon after the Germans left the site, maybe even in that winter of 39-40, illicit digging started at the site of the pylons of Ramses II, where in 1939 they had found this first hoard. The material that came out of this illicit material was then transferred slowly to Cairo. During that same time, in 1939, apparently, or between 39 and 40, the storeroom itself was broken into and everything in it ended up being moving. Almost certainly this is when the de Menil lintel found its way up to Cairo. Now, in 1942, Louis Keimer, whom I mentioned earlier as one of Steindorf's heroes, happened to be in the area drawing plant life, etc., and he saw this huge hoard of extra talatat that were coming out from illicit digging, and he made a point of reporting it. And he tried to get some interest, but we're talking about 1942. It was in the middle of the war. It wasn't likely that a whole lot was going to be done about it. Now, what we've learned is that Keimer attempted to do that. Roeder's background has now been established to have been involved with the stormtroopers in his own home areas as early as the early 1930s. And he joined the party in 1937, and in 1940, as I said, he was made director of the Berlin Museum. Oddly enough, or maybe not oddly enough, the looting that went on at the site and even the discovery of the second hoard of talatat is nowhere mentioned in the publications by Roeder, Hermann, or even more recently, Hankey, who published the Hermopolis reliefs. Hankey says in his introduction that he plans to present the manuscript as Roeder wrote it. And that is what he did. And Roeder did the same thing when he published the 10 years of excavations of Hermopolis in 1959. He had not added a word to it since 1939, and so there is no mention of the fact that after they left the site and didn't return, that this material was badly looted and has made its way around the world. Now, obviously, it's not Reuter's fault that the illicit digging and looting happened, but it's odd that he would not have mentioned this in any of their publications. Even John Cooney, who published the year before Reuter died and relied on Reuter for a lot of his information, only mentions the possibility that there was illicit digging, but never mentions looting of any sort. All right, so on to a little bit less unpleasant topic, and that is the sort of ancient history of this person whose lintel we have. Now, as I mentioned, this is from a house in Hermopolis in Middle Egypt, far, far away from Thebes, where this man, Ramses Nacht, actually conducted his work. And he is extremely well known. He has a number of statues that are known. You see one here of him kneeling, holding images of the Theban triad, Amen, Mut, and Khonsu. Now, this is the family now of Ramses Nacht and the connections of that family to other important families. But here is his father, Mary Bastet, we do not know to whom he was married. Mary Bastet has been said in many publications, including the Dealer information and John Cooney information, to have come from Hermopolis. Actually, there's nothing at all that suggests that he came from Hermopolis. But he was the father of Ramses Nacht, who became high priest of Amun. Now, he was not necessarily in any direct reason or line to become high priest. His father, Mary Bastet, however, was the chief steward, the chief administrator for the temple of Ramses III in Thebes, called Medinat Habu. Now, this was an important position because Ramses III had gone out of his way to give huge amounts of land and wealth to his own funerary temple, so he had control over it outside of the control of the temple of Karnak of Amun-Re. So this might have been one of the reasons that Ramses Nacht was able to be named by the king to be high priest of Amun, is to sort of recorrect for that. Now, Ramses Nacht had 4 children, and Usermat-Re Nacht is the one we see on the lintel, and he carries his grandfather's title. He is the chief steward for the temple of Medinat Habu. But Ramses Nacht had 2 sons who became high priest of Amun. The first was Nes-Amun, and followed by Amenhotep. Amenhotep was in that position when the sort of new kingdom quite literally came to an end. His daughter, Tameret, married a man who was a priest of Amun, and he ends up, Ramses Nacht, being depicted in that man's tomb, in fact. So this is Usermat-Re Nacht again, offering to his father, Ramses Nacht, in the tomb of Amenemope, who was married to Ramses Nacht's daughter, Tameret. All the indications are that Ramses Nacht was the first priest to actually make his family hereditary as high priests of Amun for centuries. Didn't last very long, but he was able to do it, and he certainly was probably the most powerful man in all of Egypt at that time period, because the king was in the northeastern delta and really wasn't very visible anywhere in the south. So at this point, he built an enormous complex here on the western bank, west side in the necropolis of Thebes. And it doesn't look like a great deal today, but it was actually the largest of its type in that time period. And here's a block that has his name preserved on it. It is very likely that his tomb was part of that complex, although the actual burial for him has not yet been found. But blocks naming Usermat Re Nacht have been found there. Now, just to finalize this, there's a very famous papyrus, which is in the Brooklyn Museum, called the Wilbur Papyrus, which was compiled in the reign of Ramses V. And it details the taxation for Middle Egypt that belonged, all the lands that belonged to the Temple of Amun, and exactly who administered it. Now, what you find in looking at the Wilbur Papyrus is that Usermat Re Nacht, as the chief steward of the temple at Medinet Habu, has 250 entries in the Wilbur Papyrus as someone who administers the actual lands there, which meant that almost certainly he was spending a great deal of his time in Middle Egypt at the time of census and survey every year in order to determine that taxation. So we have to think that it is a possibility, given that the family has no other links that we can find so far to Middle Egypt by birth, etc., that this may very well have been a house built for him as he was spending so much time there in that time period. And here's the actual area that is covered by the Wilbur Papyrus, and Hermopolis being nearly the most southern of those, but we see him active in all of these locations in the Wilbur Papyrus. Now, this is a statue of Ramses Nacht that was dedicated in Karnak in the Temple of Amun, but it is the only one we have that links him in any way to the god of Hermopolis. And you see that god in the form of a baboon, as if he were emerging from Ramses Nacht himself. This image is meant to remind us that this god is actually embodied inside of him and is obviously meant to increase his importance. So to return to our lintel, the possibility should really be considered that this lintel is associated with not just Ramses Nacht, but Ramses Nacht probably as deceased father of Usermat Re Nacht, who was operative in Middle Egypt in the late period of Ramses V down to Ramses XI almost, and that is the source of it coming from Middle Egypt. Thank you very much.
For Dr. Bryan.
Thanks, that was fascinating, really, really interesting. I'm just wondering, I'm obsessed with why they didn't put into the publications the looting or the theft. They had nothing to do with it, so why didn't they mention it? Or do you have any opinion on that?
I do have an idea about it, and I want to also reference the fact that there's a wonderful article by Thomas Schneider from the Journal of Egyptian History in 2012, in which he goes through a great deal of this material. But I suspect strongly that it has to do with the attempts at rehabilitating people after the war. And Roeder had a hard time. He did receive his directorship of the Hildesheim Museum back again eventually. But even that took time, and I suspect that he just couldn't bring himself to bring attention to the fact that, frankly, the market was flooded by these Amarna Talatat, and they're everywhere. I mean, the Metropolitan Museum has more than anybody else, but, you know, they're everywhere, and they're certainly looted material. But by this time, I think that he just made his mind up that he wasn't going to mention it. And as I say, Hankey, I suspect wrote or said to Hankey, don't mention this when you publish this. But Hankey then wrote a second volume of his own about material that he worked on, and he does talk about it.
Betsy, would you say something about how the sale and transfer of Egyptian antiquities worked during the war years of World War II, if you came across any sort of specifics? I'm very curious about the role of the British Army in particular in facilitating the exodus. I mean, it's the quantities of material that moved out are staggering, and it's all at all scales, not just these large-scale stoneworks, but a lot of the smaller pieces too. Did you come across any sort of descriptions of how this was working?
Unfortunately, not as yet. And I want to hasten to say that I really haven't had time to sort of get at the kind of vendor materials that might help. I just haven't had the chance to do that. But really, there is so little that we can say. I mean, Cooney mentions that he had heard of the Talatat, but he didn't see them until 1946. And I suspect that because we know they were being sold from at least 1942 onward in Cairo, I think they were coming out in batches. But the role of the British, very, very possibly, very, very possibly. But I have yet to find something that I can say is clear.
Thank you. This is a very fascinating investigative work. I just need a clarification. The correct original dimensions have as width for the lintel 18 centimeters.
Right.
The current width is only 3.8.
The which?
The present day width.
Oh.
The one you quoted originally. So I wonder what happened to this 15 centimeters. Was the piece sawn off?
I don't think it was needed to be sawed off. There were two pieces, and I think that when it was taken, either had already separated or it was felt that the other piece was not going to be very saleable in any case. So I think it was probably left at the site.
So this is the door jamb, the upper part of the door jamb. Okay.
Yeah.
I ask because very often, in order to facilitate the circulation of the pieces when looted, very often pieces are meddled with.
Right.
A famous example is the Parthenon frieze that was sawn off. A considerable amount of marble was left in Greece so that to lighten the mass that was meant to be shipped to Britain.
Yeah.
So I was wondering whether we...
Yeah, but actually, I mean, and I'm not, it's possible, but when you look at it, you can see very plainly that they found it in two pieces. And so I suspect they just left the piece that was undecorated.
Thank you.
Thank you. This is slightly different from the other questions. Currently, how actively is the Egyptian Department of Antiquity pursuing repatriation requests vis-a-vis during the period when Zahi Hawass was in charge of the department? Do you see a change as the government has changed?
Yeah, I would certainly say that the degree of intensity that Zahi had about pursuing repatriation has certainly fallen. It fell off right after the revolution. I think it will probably begin to come back because we have a minister now, Khalid El-Anani, who actually does have an interest in this. He's a little bit more of a quiet, anybody would be quiet compared to Zahi, but I think he's serious-minded about it. So I think we may start to see them make requests again, one by one. But I get no strong signal that it's going to be a sort of heavy-duty thing. Actually, a former student of mine, Yasmin El-Shazli, is actually now in the position of the person who negotiates with international things. And she's certainly not the sort of person that's going to go stride into the British Museum and demand the Rosetta Stone.
Thank you for your talk. It's fascinating. Ancient biography that you've reconstructed for this object, as well as modern. And I used to know something about Egyptology a long time ago, and I've forgotten most of it, but I just wanted to ask about the recutting you mentioned, and whether that stand that we only see faintly now was suppressed in some way as part of the history of this piece in antiquity. Is that possible?
I think it certainly was the case that people suppressed Akhenaten, but when you see thousands of his talatat being built into pylons, I suspect that this was more just to use available material. And I haven't, I've not seen the other two lintels myself, so I can't tell you whether they might have also been reused. But I do really suspect strongly that this one here might very well have originally also been a lintel, just from what we can tell about its shape and size and the decoration on the underneath. Thank you.
Okay, we have time now for a coffee break. There's coffee at the end of this corridor. We will reconvene at 11 o'clock, so I'll just ask you to be seated by then. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Bryan.